Hello, everyone. I'm Mary Valverde. Very, very happy and honored to be here. Thank you, Teresita, for inviting me. Um, like Maria, also I have many hats right now. I'm an artist. I'm a professor. I teach or I adjunct and do the adjunct shuffle in all of CUNY. And I'm also at this point, as of last year, hold the sculpture seat in the Public Design Commission for the City of New York, which is an interesting place to be in. Um, um, because of all these hats, I wanted to just sort of let you guys know that I carry all these hats because I have mentors who have dedicated themselves as a life of service, and I usually gravitate toward those kind of people because of how I was raised and who I was mentored by, specifically my parents. My parents came to the States via Ecuador in the early 70s. And because of the flux of what America or the US does, and what do other parts of the country in Latin America, economically, post 60s, and that's sort of the shift or the migration of a lot of Latinos coming to New York, specifically Ecuadorians. Um, I always thought myself to be very lucky to have grown up in New York during that time because of this sort of major flux of culture and pseudo acceptance of this sort of multiculturalism. And because I grew up in Queens in the flux of all of this culture, I had MTV, I had music, I had real hip hop to influence me and that I could access directly by just taking a subway or just by being with my older cousins. Um, and it really informed a lot of what I saw as normal, from hearing all these different languages in my own neighborhood, but also having the opportunity to go back and forth between Ecuador and New York all the time. And I never sought to try to figure out how to define myself. So I accepted and understood the African in me. I understood the indigenous in me, and I understood that there was this Spanish history, and which I'll talk about a little bit more. But my last name was a big deal to my dad, and there's these traces of sort of this need to accept or want to be part of this colonial hierarchy because he was not the wife's child. So he was sort of very colonial in Latin America. It's normal for families to have pseudo families in the same space. So my dad sort of grew up knowing he wasn't the child of the wife, but knowing that he was still part of the family and had this need to gravitate towards the last name and the name being super important. So, he sort of grew up with wanting to be arrogant, although he couldn't sort of really own that until our family came to the States, where I guess you could be anything, right? So, like I was saying, I grew up in a very Catholic, very traditional family in Queens, and not Catholic in the Eurocentric way, but you know how we do. Um, and so it was interesting because I had to sort of live in both spaces, consciously and unconsciously. I saw these patterns, and the patterns that I had for living as a Latina. I always tried to measure in visual culture through space and try to figure out that's essentially pop culture, and the patterns that I see is what I reference and acknowledge and create my work about. So I'm going to go quickly. This image is the image of my work. Yes, I'm sorry. So this is an image of my work. I'm only putting one up for reference sake. And so this is one of my most recent pieces, and it's sort of influenced by the ideas of sacred geometry and how math and theoretical physics sort of transcends the idea of abstraction and concepts and theory. And you can sort of, it's like sort of the overarching math nerd in me that I access all the time when I make artwork. So connecting patterns, connecting histories, and seeing rhythms and points of reference and everything, and from string theory and how that there's other layers and threads in our own humanity. So when I was asked to be a part of this, I asked myself, what am I going to talk about? I'm talking about history, time and place are important, experience, but overall, I think that the most important thing about this is lands, because it's always about the land, right? Even now, today, it's definitely about the land. So I'm gonna, in terms of time, space, I think about the chronology, and I think about when I think about U.S. history, the U.S. Latinx history, I think it precedes U.S. history. It precedes and predates U.S. slavery, and it predates the conquistadores. But also, in place and land, we have to mention and talk about indigenous history and the diasporic history, as well as American colonial history, right? All those things sort of affect how you feel about yourself, which brings us to the lived experience, our life, our culture, our value system overall, and the things that we view as influences. So how we create art. So I'm going to go really quickly. How do we measure this? Why? What are we measuring ourselves against? How do we define ourselves, and who benefits from this definition? That's always, as a professor, I always feel like, okay, what am I teaching? Who's benefiting from this? What are you going to get out of this experience, or me even sharing information? So when I think about Western ideas, or the way that they are defining us, I think about how they even define, how things are viewed. It's usually viewed very quantifiable, right? Made to sort of segregate us and marginalize us. So what are the attributes? So I came up with this equation, because this is my math nerd equation, right? So in the way that people have defined us, right? There is a very specific historical definition in the U.S. which sort of wants to quantify the brown person or the other person as 3/4. So I was thinking about that because I was reading about genetics the other day, and I'm thinking, like, if we were 3/5, what is the other 2/5? Like, why are we only 3/5 human? Is it because that is the only thing that they feel connecting, that is like them? So I'm thinking, what is the 2/5? The 2/5 is this sort of abstraction, right? This energy, this thing that people call instinct, or the theoretical, the abstract. And, when I think about this, I think, like, what does that define us as? And then we are magic, right? Because it's like the stuff in space that they cannot define or they cannot quantify. So that's my definition of who I am and what this platform is. We are magic. When it's not a space for us to sort of define altogether. It's sort of a platform for us to open up the conversation and the dialogue, and to have us be more than what they define us to be. So that's it. Thank you.